我姓欧阳，叫欧阳康。希望大家能够认识我。今天我们请来了一位非常特殊的客人，他是牛津大学的教授，宗教学教授，也是哲学教授，Richard Swinburne。Richard Swinburne 先生，同时也是英国文化委员会委员，或者如果是用我们中文来翻成，就是中国科学院的院士。这在英国是最高的学术地位的一个象征。Richard先生是在英国的牛津大学念完了本科、硕士和博士，然后一直在那个地方教书。我和Richard先生的认识是在14年前，当时我在英国学习，我是在伦敦大学 UCL University College London。当时我主编了一套书，叫做《当代英美哲学》，其中包含了2部分，一部分是当代英美哲学地图 （Map of Contemporary British and American Philosophy）， 另外一本书叫做《当代英美著名哲学家学术自述》。这一套书是西方学者，尤其是英国和美国学者，专门为中国哲学界写的第一套书。这一套书在2005年已经由人民出版社出版。在这一本书中 ，Richard Swinburne 先生应我的邀请，专门给我们写了宗教学研究一章。从此以后啊，我们一直有着非常密切的联系。那么今天到场的我们的欧阳书通博士是哲学系的教师。他的博士导师是香港浸会大学的一个教授，而这个教授是Richard Swinburne教授的学生，所以今天他的师爷来了，他的接待。Richard Swinburne先生对于宗教学的研究，应该说在全世界居于领先的地位。我当时邀请的36位学者。他在宗教学里边可以说是首屈一指。当时的20章吧，包含了本体论啊、认识论啊、逻辑学呀、宗教学呀、伦理学等等，都是各个领域的基本上是一把手。他写了有10多本书，关于宗教学的，包括神学的，包括基督教的。那么他最近啊，已经把这一些书送到了美国的一个学术基金会，准备了10套分送给中国的大学，其中也包含了华中科技大学。不久以后，大家将可以在华中科技大学哲学系的资料室里边读到他的主要的著作。今天他送了一本书给我 ，Is there a God？ 有上帝吗？今天他要讨论的问题是一个非常重大的问题。就是既然这个世界已经有了一个全知全能的上帝，为什么世界还会有这么多罪恶？当然，他的论证的结果和他的过程，大家能不能够接受，大家可以去听，可以去讨论。但是我想这个问题是值得我们来思考。大家知道，在整个西方文化的发展里边，宗教扮演了重要的角色，尤其是当初形态的天主教和后来演变出来的基督教等等吧。那么在今天的西方文化里边，宗教文化仍然占有重要的地位。所以我们想，对于理解西方文化、了解西方的宗教，这是一个非常重要的方面，可以说是一个必修课。这一次，施文凤先生是专门到香港浸会大学开会，然后了解到有可能在我们的学期开学之初来到我们学校，所以他就特地安排时间专程赶过来。昨天晚上已经在哲学系做了一个讲座，讲的是身心关系与意志自由。明天晚上有兴趣的同学还可以到那儿去听他的第2场讲座。明天下午3点钟，在 东5楼的5层的报告厅，还会有一场讲座，也涉及到相关的意志自由的问题。大家知道，我们人呐，都在追求一种自由，这一种自由可能会有很多的局限，其中包含着我们的身体的局限，也包含了我们的心灵的和社会的局限。如何在这样一种局限中间去寻求意志的自由，这对于人类来说可以说是一个永恒的话题，对于每一个人来说也是如此。欢迎大家到时候去听。今天晚上的讲座，我想的是请他先讲，大概50分钟左右，然后大家可以提问题，可以有50分钟，我们到9点正确能够结束。这一次孙木先生能够顺利的成行也是非常不容易的。大家知道英国下了大雪，他在下雪的前几个小时离开了英国，赶到了香港。昨天他从香港到武汉的航班延迟3个小时，但是他顺利过来了，晚上的航班取消了。后天他就要离开。Now I'd like to speak something in English. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Humanities Forum, this 1444. Please note that we have already 1,443 at least, I think, already standing here and gave us some lectures. But this is the first lecture in this new term and after the new year. Now we are still in the new year, I think. Some people said that 15th month will become strong, smooth. Then 16th, 15的月亮是6月。I can't speak that in Chinese, so sorry for that. But I want to say something is very good wishes for you and for our guests. That's Professor Swinburne. He especially come here for deliver some lectures. And yesterday he delivered a lecture in philosophy department, and today he visited our museum and the city. He got a very deep impression. He admired our students, and now we have one more chance. We can exchange our ideas with him, but first we should listen his lecture. You already have some outline of his lecture in Chinese, but most of you may not get it, but you can read it in English. After that, about 50 minutes lecture, you will have a chance to ask questions. So please prepare your question from now on. Now, let us welcome Professor Richard Swinburne.
Thank you for turning out in such large numbers to hear what will, I fear, be a slightly complicated lecture in a language which is not your own and has a structure very different from your own. And I very much appreciate you coming to listen to me in these circumstances, and especially in these very crowded circumstances this evening. In this lecture, that's a bit loud.
Okay.
In this lecture, it's a little loud, isn't it? Can you not merely hear me, but isn't this a little loud for you? Okay, right. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the most important objection to the truth of any religion of a Western kind. that is, any religion such as Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. These religions all claim that the universe was made by God, who is an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good spiritual being, and who keeps the universe in existence from moment to moment. This claim that there is a God of this kind is called theism. By God being omnipotent, I mean that God can do anything, or rather anything logically possible, that is, anything the description of which is not self-contradictory. He can, for example, annihilate the universe, or change the laws of nature so that material objects no longer attract each other or fall to the ground on earth. But, because it involves a self-contradiction, he cannot make me exist and not exist at the same time. By God being omniscient, I mean that he knows everything, knows what has happened and what will happen everywhere. Or rather, he knows everything logically possible to know, anything which is such that there is no contradiction involved in supposing that he knows it. If human beings have free will, so that it is not predetermined by our brain states or by anything else what we will do, then God cannot know in advance what we will do tomorrow, for in that case it would not be up to us what we will do tomorrow. But if God exists, it will only be by God's choice that we have any free will, and so that there is such a limit to God's knowledge. By God being perfectly good, I mean that all his actions are good actions, and he does no bad action. So that's the definition of God. The claim of Western religion is that there is such a omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being. The major objection to theism is that this world contains much evil. Humans suffer a lot, and humans do what is evil by causing other humans to suffer. An omnipotent God could have prevented humans from suffering or from causing others to suffer. And if he is perfectly good, he would have done this. For is it not a bad action to cause suffering, or to permit others to cause suffering, which one can prevent? Hence, the objection goes, there cannot be a God of the Western kind. That is the objection to theism. I shall now seek to rebut this objection. I shall argue that it is not a bad act for someone to cause suffering, or allow others to cause suffering, so long as certain conditions are satisfied, and I shall suggest that they are satisfied when the someone is God and the suffering is the actual sufferings of this world. And so I shall conclude that the evils of the world do not tend to show that there is no God. Now consider an ordinary human. An ordinary human is still good if he causes suffering or allows others to cause suffering, so long as allowing that suffering is the only way in which he can promote some good. So long as he does promote that good, so long as he has the right to allow the suffering to occur, that's to say it's morally permissible for him to do so, and so long as the good is good enough to risk the occurrence of the suffering. For example, a human parent may take a child to the dentist and allow him to suffer a tooth being filled for the sake of his subsequent dental health, so long as that is the only way in which the human can promote this good state, in which the human parent can promote this good state. And as a parent, he does have the right to take the child, possibly against his will, to the dentist. The latter clause, that he has the right, is important. No complete stranger has the right to take a child to the dentist to have his tooth filled without the permission of the child's parents, even if she thereby promotes a good state. Now, we humans cannot always give a child dental health without the child having to suffer, but God could. It is only the logically impossible that God is unable to do. So, extrapolating from the case of suffering to the case of evils generally, and from that case to the case of a God who can do anything logically possible, I suggest that a God of the Western kind could allow an evil E to occur compatible with his perfect goodness so long as 4 conditions are satisfied. These conditions are on your handout in Chinese. First, it must be logically impossible for God to bring about some good G in any other morally permissible way than by allowing E or an evil equally bad to occur. For example, it's logically impossible for God to give us libertarian free will to choose between good and bad. What I mean by libertarian free will is free will to choose between good and bad despite all the causal influences to which we are subject. It's logically impossible for God to give us libertarian free will to choose between good and bad and yet also cause us to choose the good. Either he gives it up to us or he makes us do the good, but he can't do both for logical reasons. It's logically impossible for God to bring about the good of us having such a free choice without allowing the evil of a bad choice to occur, if that is what we choose. That's the first condition. Secondly, God must bring about the good state, G. Thus, if he take a different example, if he brings about pain in order to give us the opportunity of choosing of our own free will whether to bear this pain courageously or not, he must also have given us this free will. Thirdly, God has to have the right to allow E to occur. That is to say, he must be in a position where he is entitled to cause us to suffer for some greater good. And finally, the good must be a big enough good, or put more precisely, the probable amount of evil which would result from allowing E to occur must be less than the goodness of G. Reflecting on the moral conditions under which some human might cause evil to others and yet still be a good human, I've suggested these are the conditions under which God might cause us to suffer while remaining perfectly good. 4 conditions, it's important to bear them in mind, they're on your handout. I begin by pointing out ways in which the first condition, assuming there is a God, is satisfied for various kinds of evils which occur frequently on earth. I begin with what is called moral evil, that is, the evil which either deliberately or through negligence humans cause to each other. And I've already pointed out that the great good of having a libertarian free will to choose between good and evil logically can only be brought about by allowing the agent to bring about evil. But a free choice which made no difference to the world would not be nearly as valuable a choice as one which made a difference. It would be a great good for humans to have libertarian free choices which allow us to exercise a genuine responsibility for other humans, and that involves the opportunity to benefit or harm those other humans. This sort of free will I'll call responsible free will, not merely the free will to choose between good and evil, but the free will to make a real difference to others through your choice. God has the power to benefit or harm humans. If other agents, such as ourselves, are to be given a share in his creative work, it would be good that they should have that power too, although perhaps to a lesser degree. A world in which agents can benefit each other but cannot do each other harm is one where they have only limited responsibility for each other. If my responsibility for you is limited to whether or not to give you a camcorder, but I cannot cause you pain, stunt your growth, or limit your education, then I do not have a great deal of responsibility for you. A God who gave agents only such limited responsibilities for their fellows would not have given much. God would have reserved for himself the all-important choice of the kind of world it was to be,
while simply allowing humans the minor choice of filling in the details. God would be like a father asking his elder son to look after the younger son and adding that he would be watching the elder son's every move and would intervene the moment the elder son did a thing wrong. The elder son might justly retort that while he would be happy to share his father's work, he could really only do so if he were left to make up his own judgments as to what to do within a significant range of the options available to the father. A good God, like a good father, will delegate responsibility. But in order to allow creatures a share in creation, God has to allow them the choices of hurting and maiming, of frustrating the divine plan, if that is what they choose. So, by allowing such hurting and maiming, God makes possible the great good of humans freely choosing to benefit rather than harm each other, and thus cooperate in God's plan. You can only really be responsible for somebody if what happens to them really depends on you, and that can only be if you can choose either to benefit them or to harm them. If God so arranged it so that you can't harm them, God has reserved for himself the responsibility that it would be good that you should have. But human choices are not merely good in themselves and in virtue of their immediate consequences. All human choices are character forming. Each good choice you make makes it easier to make the next choice a good one, and so agents form their own characters. Aristotle famously remarked, quote, "We become just by doing just acts, prudent by doing prudent acts, brave by doing brave acts." That is, by doing a just act when it's difficult, when it goes against our natural inclinations, our desires, we make it easier to do a just act next time. We can gradually change our desires so that, for example, doing just acts becomes natural. Thereby we can free ourselves from the power of the less good desires to which we are subject. But again, the great good of us having the free choice of character formation, choosing the sort of persons we are to be, can logically only be had if there is the danger that we will allow ourselves to corrupt our characters and to become bad people. It can only be up to you whether you're going to form a good character if you have the alternative of not doing so. Now, I've been talking so far about moral evil, which is the harm we do to each other, and why God might allow that. But there's also the other sort of evil, natural evil. Natural evil is evil of a kind unpreventable by humans, such as the evil of suffering caused by disease of a kind currently unpreventable. What is known as the higher order goods defense points out that certain kinds of especially valuable free choice are possible only as responses to evils. I can, logically, only show courage in bearing my suffering if I am suffering an evil state. My suffering from disease when I have the strong temptation to self-pity gives me the occasion, the opportunity to show courage. It's good that we shall have the opportunity occasionally to do such actions which involve resisting great temptations, because thereby we manifest our total commitment to the good. A commitment which we do not make when the temptation to do otherwise is not strong is not a total commitment. Thereby, if we pursue the good despite great contrary temptation, we would freely form a really holy character, not just a fairly good character. So, I'm working up to pointing out that it's only in these difficult circumstances when we are suffering or strongly tempted to be self-pitying or run away from danger that we can show great courage and by that make a really great character, not just a moderately good one. It's good too that among the good actions which we should have the opportunity occasionally to do is to help others who are suffering and deprived, by showing sympathy to them and helping them to cope. Help is most significant when it's most needed, and it's most needed when its recipient is suffering and deprived. But it's only logically possible for me to help others who are suffering if there is the evil of their suffering. In these cases, if there is a God, he makes possible the good of free choices of particular kinds between good and evil, which logically he could not give us without allowing the evils, or evils equally bad, to occur. And merely allowing the suffering caused by moral evil would not give us very much opportunity for the choices which involve resisting great temptations. For this, we need disease, accident, and the weakness of old age. I'm pointing out that if we, merely having the opportunity of how to cope with harm done to us by other people wouldn't give us very much. Other people are on the whole quite nice, so they don't harm us all the time. It wouldn't give us great opportunity for manifesting the great virtues of sympathy, courage, patience, and so on. And for that we do need disease, accident, old age, in order to give us the opportunity rightly to react in these ways and so form an holy character. It is good, too, that among the choices available to humans should be the choice not merely of helping others to cope with natural evils such as disease, but of whether to reduce the number of such natural evils in future, that is, prevent diseases in future. But to have this choice, we need to know what causes the evils. The normal way in which we, the scientists among us, that is, supported by money from the rest of us, try to discover such things is the inductive way. That is, we seek to discover the natural processes, bacteria, viruses, and so on, which bring about diseases, and then construct and test theories of the mechanisms involved. But scientists can only do that if there are regular processes producing the diseases, and they can only learn what these are by studying many populations and studying under which circumstances some disease is transmitted and under which it is not. So, for having the great good of this choice of investigating what causes the disease, or alternatively not bothering to investigate, have a choice between putting a lot of money, time and so on into investigating the cause of the disease, or not bothering to do so, in order to have this opportunity, there is required the necessary evil of the actual disease for us to study. If humans are to have the great opportunity of devoting their lives to scientific research for human benefit, or not bothering to do so, there have to be sufferers from disease to make this possible. Many of the early Christian fathers, as they were called, the early Christian theologians, saw rationality, of which the ability to pursue such scientific inquiry is a paradigmatic example, saw rationality together with free will as the two things which humans had, which constituted their being made, as the first book of the Bible says, their being made in the image of God. The early theologians saw our having free will and having rationality, both of which I pointed out are much enhanced by the existence of evils, as the two things which make humans like God in certain respects. All the same, you may say, would it not be better if God simply gave us strong, true beliefs about the causes of all diseases and other natural evils, implanted them in our minds at birth, and then just left us with the choice of curing these diseases or not? Is having the opportunity to exercise rationality in the inductive way worth the price, worth the diseases? However, if God abolished the need for rational inquiry and gave us strong, true beliefs about the causes of things, that would greatly reduce the difficulty of making moral decisions. It would make it much easier to make moral decisions. And because if we knew the answer as to what caused the disease, we would then know how to cure it, and it would be much easier to decide whether to do so. If God gave us implanted in our brains strong, true beliefs about the causes of things, that would greatly reduce the difficulty of making moral decisions, and so make it much less easy for us to show total commitment to the good and form heroic characters. As things are in the actual world, most moral decisions are decisions taken in uncertainty about the consequences of our actions. I do not know, for example, that if I smoke I will get cancer, or that if I do not give money to some charity, people will starve. I think I may get cancer if I smoke, but I don't know. I think it may help a lot of people if I give money to charity, but maybe it won't. And it's under these circumstances that we have to make our moral decisions. We have to make them on the basis of how probable it is that our actions will have various outcomes. How probable it is that I will get cancer if I continue to smoke, or that someone will starve if I do not give money to a charity. These decisions under uncertainty are not merely the normal moral decisions, they are also the hard ones. Since probabilities are so hard to assess, it's all too easy to persuade yourself that it's worth taking the chance that no harm will result from the less demanding decision, that is, the decision which you've got a strong desire to make. And even if you face up to a correct assessment of the probabilities, true dedication to the good is doing an act which, although it's probably the best action, may have no good consequences at all. So, the sum of this particular argument, the last few minutes I've been pointing out that among the advantages provided by disease and accident, and of course I'm not denying they're very bad things, but among the great advantages provided by them is that we, scientists and others, can decide whether or not to investigate them, and God doesn't give us the clear answer to this because he wants us to have a choice. At least it's plausible to suppose that a good God would want us to have a choice between deciding whether to investigate these matters or not, when the whole thing may lead to nowhere, may provide a waste of money, and you show your dedication to the good in trying to achieve good ends when you may not, and it's difficult. And that's the reason why God shouldn't provide us with the answers, but leave us to see whether or not to find them. So, both in order to give us the opportunity to deal with all-important matters by exercising our rationality, and in order to give us the opportunity of showing our commitment to the good most strongly by making our choices in a situation of uncertainty, it is good that God should not cause us to be born with strong, true beliefs about the consequences of our actions, and so that we should have the opportunity to choose whether or not to seek more certain knowledge of the consequences of those actions. And seeking more certain knowledge will involve getting more data about the consequences of events. For example, data from the past about what has happened to people who have smoked in ignorance of the possibility that smoking causes cancer. Which make a difference to our brain states and thereby to which public actions we perform. Is it really up to us, or are we caused by our environment and our genes to make the choices we do? Well, as we make our choices, it seems that it's up to us how we choose, and it's a basic principle of rationality that it's probable that things are the way they seem to be in the absence of a contrary reason. I don't think there is any adequate reason for denying that things are as they seem to us in this respect. It used to be claimed that science has shown that nature is deterministic. The laws of nature inevitably determine what will happen. It used to be said that science had shown that nature is deterministic, and so our choices must be caused. Yet, according to what I take to be the majority view among physicists today, quantum theory has shown that even the physical world is not deterministic on the small scale. So it would not be surprising if the mental world of feeling, thought and choice is not deterministic, and any action of the mental world to produce small-scale changes on the brain wouldn't even disrupt the operation of normal physical laws, that is, the laws of quantum theory. That is, science suggests that in fact even the brain is not a deterministic system. The laws of nature don't determine what the brain will do, and so of course they don't determine how we make a difference to the brain and to the world thereby. So I conclude that while the issue is certainly not yet settled, it's reasonable to assume, in the absence of contrary evidence, that we do have libertarian free will, and that our exercise makes a difference to what we do in the public world. Given that we do have libertarian free will, it is certainly responsible free will. Our actions make the great differences to ourselves and each other, which I have illustrated, and thereby we have serious responsibility for ourselves and for each other. So, given that there are goods and evils for which conditions 1 and 2 are satisfied, what about condition 3? Does God have the right to cause or allow evil to occur to humans for the sake of some greater good? The trouble may seem more acute in that in many cases, such as some I've just been discussing, good for one individual is promoted by evil endured by a different individual. Does God have the right to make you suffer for my benefit? To cause, or sometimes even to allow, someone to suffer for his own good or for the good of someone else, one has to stand in some kind of parental relationship towards him. I don't have the right to cause some stranger, Joe Bloggs, to suffer for his own good or for that of Bill Snoggs, but I do have some right of this kind in respect of my own children. I may let my son suffer somewhat for his own good or for the good of his elder brother, as when I entrust the younger son to the temporary care of the elder son, with the risk that the elder may hurt the younger. Or I may send my daughter to a neighbourhood school which she may not much enjoy, but which will benefit others of the neighbourhood. I have such a right in respect of a child of mine, because in small part I am responsible for the child's life, and for so many of the good things which it involves. It is because a parent, who is not merely a biological parent, but also a nurturing parent, because the parent is the source of much good for the child, that he is entitled to take some of it, or its equivalent, back if necessary, in the form of the life having bad aspects. If the child could understand, he would understand that the parent gives life nourishment and education, subject to possible retraction of some of the gift. If that's correct, then a God, as postulated by Western religion, who is so much more the source of our being than are our parents, has so many more rights in this respect, for we depend on him totally from moment to moment, and the ability of parents and others to benefit us depends on him. But it must remain the case that God's rights are limited by the condition that he must not over time take back more than he gives. He must remain, on balance, a benefactor. But there do so often look to be lives in which the bad outweighs the good, about which we say that it would be better for such a person not to have lived. I urge, however, that this is a wrong assessment of many lives, because it does not take into account a good which I have not so far mentioned, the good of being of use to others. It's an enormous good for anyone to be of use, whether by what they do by their free choice, or by what they do involuntarily, or by what happens to them, including what they suffer. Helping someone freely is clearly a great good for the helper, great good for the helper. We sometimes help prisoners not by giving them more comfortable quarters, but by letting them help the handicapped. And we pity rather than envy the poor little rich girl who has everything and does nothing for anything else. And one phenomenon prevalent from time to time in contemporary Western Europe draws this good especially to our attention, the evil of unemployment. Because, at any rate in Western societies, our systems of social security ensure that the unemployed on the whole have enough money to live without too much discomfort. Certainly they are a lot better off than are many employed in Africa or Asia or 19th century Britain. What is evil about the sort of unemployment which occurs in contemporary Western Europe is not so much any resulting poverty, but the uselessness of the unemployed. They often retort feeling unvalued by society, of no use, on the scrap heap. They rightly think it would be a good for them to contribute, but they can't. And I'm bring this example in order to point out that it's a great good for somebody to be of use to somebody else, great good for the somebody. And it is not only intentional actions freely chosen, but also ones performed involuntarily, which have good consequences for others, which constitute a good for those who do them. If the unemployed were compelled to work for some useful purpose, they would surely be right to regard that as a good for them, in comparison with being useless. And it is not only intentional actions, but experiences undergone involuntarily, or involuntary curtailment of good experiences as by death. It is not only actions, but experiences which have good consequences, which constitute a good for those who have them. Consider the conscript killed in a just and ultimately successful war in defence of his country against the tyrannous aggressor. Almost all peoples, apart from, I don't know how the Chinese react to this, but almost all peoples apart from those of the Western world in our generation have recognized that dying for one's country is a great good for the one who dies, even if he was conscripted, that is to say, made to fight. Or consider too someone hurt or killed in an accident where the accident leads to some reform which prevents the occurrence of similar accidents in future. For example, someone killed in a rail crash which leads to the installation of a new system of railway signalling which prevents similar accidents in the future. The victim and his relatives often comment in such a situation that at any rate he did not suffer or die in vain. Although, of course, they normally regard the suffering or death as on balance an evil, they would have regarded it as a greater misfortune for the victim, quite apart from the consequences for others, if his suffering or death had served no useful purpose. It is a good for us if our experiences are not wasted, but are used for the good of others, if they are the means of a benefit which would not have come to others without them. It follows from being of use being a great good, that whenever God allows some evil to occur to B, for example, causes B to suffer, in order to provide some good for A, for example, the free choice of how to react to the suffering, that B is benefited as well. His life is not wasted. He is of use, either by enduring some evil or by his availability to do so. He is of use to A, but he is also of use to God. He plays a role in God's plan for A. And to be of use to the good source of being in the redemption of his creation is an enormous good. The starving, the persecuted, and the abused are of use to the wealthy on whose doorstep they appear, because, but for them, the wealthy would have no opportunity to be of use. They are the vehicle whereby alone the wealthy can be saved, from self-indulgence and learned generosity, and thereby they are of use to God himself. When one takes into account that those whose evil state is the means of great good to others, and also, of course, often to themselves, thereby also receive this enormous benefit, it becomes plausible to suppose that God has the right to cause the evil. For however you weigh the one against the other, the evil carries with it the great good of being of use, which contributes towards making the lives of the victims on balance good lives, and so ones in which God has the right to include such evil. But, I must add, if any life on earth is still on balance bad, if there are lives which are lives of suffering, in which, yes, the suffering is of use for some purpose, but they're lives of considerable suffering, and you would say, all the same, despite the fact of their being of use for some purpose, they are on balance lives which it would have been better if the sufferer had not lived. If there are such lives, God has a duty to compensate for the bad in the afterlife, in the life after death, which is always part of the Western religious tradition. God has a duty to compensate for the bad in the afterlife, so that the total life of such an individual will be on balance good. That in his omnipotence he can do, and all Western religions hold that humans live again in a new world after their death. And clearly God can compensate any persons whose lives on earth are on balance bad with a good afterlife. So, conditions 1, 2 and 3 I've talked. To remind you, first condition, God being justified in allowing an evil to occur, is it must be the only way in which it's logically possible for God to promote a good. God must provide that good. God must have the right to provide that, to cause that evil, and he does have the right, since he is the source of so much good to us in general, that he has the right, as it were, to take some of it back, to use it as a means to providing good for others. But if there are lives which he takes so much back that they're on balance not good lives, then he must make them good lives by providing a compensating life after death. But I've pointed out that many lives which we're inclined to say about that wasn't on balance a life which it's good to have led, it probably was a good life, a life which it was good to have led, when you take into account the good for the sufferer of being of use to someone else. And now I come finally to the fourth comparative condition. That is, the good has got to be a good enough good for God to justify, to be allowed to be justified in providing evil. You may agree with me that one does need a substantial amount of various kinds of evil in order to provide the opportunities for various goods. But you may feel that there's just too much evil in the world for the good which it makes possible. You may think there's just not enough good made possible by Hiroshima, the slave trade, the Holocaust, or the Soviet slave camps of the Gulag archipelago, with the objection that if there is a God, he's overdone it. I feel considerable initial sympathy. And when I now proceed to justify God allowing these things, I hope you will not think me callous. These are horrible things, and when they happen to people, we must weep. But in cooler moments, and I hope this is one of them, we must analyze the logical issues in as rigorous a dispassionate way as we can, and we must take very seriously the goods which the evils make possible. What makes these massive evils massive is mainly the number of people involved. But if each suffering of 1,000 people is such that my 4 conditions are satisfied for it, then the suffering of the whole 1,000 will also be such that those conditions are satisfied. So, given that one person being maimed in some earthquake provides that person with the opportunity to show courage, and his relatives with the opportunity to show compassion and help, then 1,000 people being maimed provides 1,000 such opportunities. Each small addition to the number of sufferers makes a smaller addition to the number of those who can make serious good choices. And each small diminution of sufferers makes a small diminution in the number of those who can make serious good choices. Sometimes the problem with great evils is not the sufferers, but the number of sufferers, but the degree of the suffering. If there is a God, is not the suffering which he imposes or allows others to impose sometimes too intense for the good which it makes possible? But then evils wouldn't matter so much if only the lesser evils occurred, and so it wouldn't matter so much if we ignored the evils. By allowing the more serious evils to occur, God forces on people who have allowed themselves to live easy lives and so become insensitive to more ordinary moral demands, the hard choices which alone, given their moral torpor, will allow them to become holy people rather than sink into a subhuman selfishness. It is the really big disasters that force ordinary, rather selfish people to face up to the moral dilemmas. So, many ordinary selfish people who see evils of serious torture or very painful disease are moved to make those life-changing choices which no ordinary evils would move them to make, choices by which they can eventually become saints. What the objector is asking for is, yes, there should be diseases, but not ones which maim or kill. Accidents, yes, which incapacitate people for a year or two, but not for life. We should be able to cause each other pain or avoid helping each other to acquire knowledge, but we shouldn't be able to damage our own or each other's characters. This is the objector speaking. And our influence should be limited to those with whom we come into contact. There should be no possibility of influencing later generations for good or ill. And most of our beliefs, suggests the objector, about how to cause effects, good or evil, should be beliefs with which we are born. We shouldn't have to investigate them, and thereby there shouldn't have to be evils for us to investigate. But if we gave in to this understandable request that from the objector says, yes, certain sorts of evils really are necessary for certain sorts of goods, but evil shouldn't be too bad. A very natural reaction to this sort of paper. Such a world, if we accepted that objection, the world the objector is asking for would be a toy world, a world where things matter, but not very much, where we can choose and our choices can make a small difference, but the real choices are God's. We are not allowed the privilege of the real choice. The objector is asking that God should not be willing to be generous and trust us with his world, and not give us occasional opportunities to show ourselves at our heroic best. But surely, says the objector, there is a limit to the suffering which a God would be justified in causing for the sake of the good which it makes possible. Yes, of course, there is such a limit. And there is also a limit to the actual amount of suffering which any human suffers. There is a limit of time. These days it's roughly 80 years, though it's getting a bit longer. And there is clearly also a limit of intensity. For each human, there is a limit of 80 years during which he can suffer. What the objector must be claiming is that the actual limit is too wide. If there is a God, he's asking too much of us. But the objector must take into account the great benefits for the sufferer, which I discussed earlier, of having a free choice of how to cope with his suffering and form a holy character, and being privileged by his suffering to give others the opportunity to help him. When these things are taken into account, there begins, I believe, to be considerable plausibility in the claim that the expected benefit of God allowing that quantity and degree of suffering to occur which actually occurs outweighs the evil of the suffering. Let me help you to see this by a small thought experiment. Suppose you exist in another world before your birth in this one, and you're given a choice as to the sort of life you are to have in this one. You are told that you are only to have a short life, although it will be an adult life in the sense that you will have the richness of sensation and belief characteristic of adults. You have a choice as to the sort of life you will have. You can have either a few months of very considerable pleasure, of the kind produced by some drug such as heroin, which you will experience by yourself and which will have no effects at all on the world. For example, no one else will know about it. That's one choice. Either a few months of very considerable pleasure of the kind produced by some drug such as heroin, which you experience by yourself and has no effects at all on the world. That's one sort of life you could choose. Alternatively, you can have a few months of considerable pain, such as the pain of childbirth, which will have, unknown to you at the time of the pain, considerable good effects over several years on others yet to be born. You're told that if you don't make the second choice, those others will never exist, and so you are under no moral obligation to make the second choice. Moral obligations are only obligations to someone, and you can't therefore have moral obligations to those who don't exist. But you seek to make the choice which will make your life the best for you to have led. I repeat, either a few months of really intense pleasure, all by yourself, nobody else knows about it, no effects. Other sort of life, a life of considerable pain, such as the pain of childbirth, which will produce other people who will have happy lives, though you don't realize that at the time. You're under no obligation to make the second choice, because if you don't make the second choice, there won't be anybody to be obliged to. So, which is the choice which is the best for you, not for anybody else, which will make your life the life most worth having? And think about it, but I suggest the choice is the second one, which will make your life, after the event, you would say, obviously lived the second life. My life was a good life to have led, because I was the source of so much good to others. Whereas if you had taken the first choice, I don't think you'd have said that. Of course, a God would be mad to allow endless suffering, to give endless such opportunities for painful service. But if there is a God, he does not give any of us, except through our own choice, endless suffering. He allows suffering at most for the short period of our earthly life, in order that in that life we may help others and form ourselves in deeply significant ways, and we would be the poorer without these opportunities. For these reasons, I suggest that the claim of Western religion that there is a God does have an answer to the most powerful objection against it. Thank you. Now, the point of a lecture such as this is to allow you to come to me and to ask me questions. So, and by questions is a polite word for it. I want objections too. There's a microphone, is there?
You use that one, and we can get that to him. Yeah.
What's the microphone?
因为它那个有
这个是移动的吗？不是移动的。
You want mine? All right. Have mine. Is this one off or
So thank you. I have one question. As we know, you is a problem, and according to your conclusion, you must occur. So what can be done to make our life better? Is there a chance that human can deal with you properly, so that everyone in every country can enjoy themselves And if there is a chance, how long will be taken? Thank you.
I didn't quite understand that. You're saying, I'm sorry, I may have missed something. How long will it take to make the world happy, you're saying?
Yeah.
Would you translate that into Chinese for the audience?
用中文给大家说一下。
就是根据你的结论，就是上帝允许恶的存在。我想问的是，有没有那种机会，就是让世界上所有的人都能够生活的快乐？如果有这种机会的话，我们应该怎么做，或者是说需要多久，付出多大的精力来达到这一点？
Well, you may recall that I claim we have free will, so that's up to us. I don't know what we will do, and I cannot predict. And if I'm right, I don't think God can know for certain what we will do. It's up to us. We have the free choice. So I can't answer that question. Could you all keep quiet apart from the person asking the question, please? Yes. Pass the mic back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swinburne. It's my great honor to raise the question. And there is a very popular saying, God bless you or God bless us. Everybody knows that. And by saying this, it means when you sneeze, when someone sneezes, of course, a Western or an American, when him or her sneezes, the people around him would probably say, God bless you. And someone told me it's a kind of superstition. And I don't think so, because I think it's just religion. And so my question is, what's the discrepancy between religion and superstition by their nature? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a big question which doesn't quite focus on my lecture, so I'm going to give you a very brief answer. I think there are truths about religion, some e.g. that there is a God, and I think God has certain properties, and I think certain good arguments can be given for this. And therefore, a superstition consists of a number of false beliefs about God or gods. The distinction I would make would be between different religious systems, verging from ones which are very largely true down to ones which are very largely false, and we give the name of superstition to ones which we think are false. They may not be, of course, but that's the use of the word. It's much more important, as it were, to investigate these issues and consider what are the truths about the matter. But that's a very general answer to a very general question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So, yeah.
你传一下。
I have a question. You think that the balance, the extra balance, comes from our God? Should come? Is the extra balance should come? Does the extra balance come from our obligation, our responsibility to make contribution to our society? And I think in the field of our scientific, we have the law of energy conservation. They all keep in balance, but that the law also apply to the field of philosophy.
I'm sorry, let me get this question first, and then you put it in Chinese. The law of balance, you say, or the law of conservation of energy applies to philosophy. In what sense?
也就是说，在哲学上，你说的上帝的好与坏，是上帝的善多于恶，但是在自然科学上，就是事物的两个方面是对立的，而且是等价的。那么，我们是否能够在哲学上说，上帝的善与恶是否能够相等？那么，如果不相等，那么那额外的善是否来源于我们对社会的一种责任与义务，对社会所做出的贡献 ？Thank you very much.
In philosophy, the good of God is equal to the evil of God. But in science, his opinion just good and evil is equivalent.
Yes. Okay. I understand that you said that in philosophy there's equal good and evil. I must make clear that the views which I have been expressing in this paper are my views, and the majority of philosophers would not agree with them. I'm presenting them to you to see whether you agree with them or not. So, as it were, this is not a common philosophical orthodoxy. I think it's a view which any religious believer ultimately needs to hold, but of course the majority of philosophers in the West are not religious believers, though some are. So this is my view. Now, I'm not suggesting that, as it were, there is a mixture of good and evil in God. I'm suggesting that God is like the good parent who unfortunately has to make the child suffer for the sake of some greater good. The parent who takes the child to the dentist, to take a rather small and trivial example, for the sake of the child's health, and he does thereby make the child suffer. But it's all for the good. And my suggestion is that God only allows us to cause evil or imposes evil upon us for the sake of a greater good. So it's not there's a balance, there's an enormous overweight of the good over the evil. And there's a lot more good than there would be if God didn't allow the evil. That's the point. Right, lady here.
Good evening, Professor.
Some words of
Yeah.
Dr. Lecture. Continue.
There are innumerable benefits that God conveys to us human beings, and so that there's a saying goes that what terms of affliction in the language of man are in the language of God, styled blessings. So, how do you understand this saying?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite with you. Could you just repeat it again?
There are innumerable benefits that God conveys to us human beings.
Yes.
So that there's a saying goes that in the language, what terms of affliction in the language of man are in the language of God.
What is this word language?
In the language of man.
Language, yes.
Yes.
In the language of man.
The language of man are in the language of God. The styled blessing. Styled blessing. So how do you understand this thing?
In the language of God.
就是说，上帝就是给人类很多恩赐，都是通过苦难来传达的。那么这儿有一句话就这么说，就是在人类语言中的苦难，在上帝的语言中，是既定的恩典。您怎样理解这句话？
The people suffering are given in God's plan.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yes and no. That is to say, when somebody hurts you, God doesn't plan for them to hurt you. He wishes they wouldn't hurt you. But He allows them to hurt you for their sake and for yours, because there are benefits to both him having the free choice and to you as to how to cope with the suffering. But he certainly doesn't want you. He certainly doesn't want the ill-doer to hurt you. So he doesn't plan for it, but he plans for it, the possibility of it. And ultimately, I think, yes, he gives us plenty of opportunities so that we will ultimately form holy characters and become saints if we choose, and become very happy, and everybody become very happy if they choose. But I do emphasize that I think it's important, in the Christian religion at any rate, that we have free will, that it's up to us, it's up to somebody else whether they hurt you. God will help you cope with the consequences and help the hurter cope with the consequences. But if you really take seriously the suggestion that he has given us free will, he leaves it to a considerable extent up to us. But it's by his choice and his plan that it is up to us. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I have a second question.
No, you don't. We're now going to have a comment from here.
是我先用中文说啊，是这样的，就是大家可能就是当然那个教授讲看那个上面的英文的时候，不一定反应过来了。我可能觉得我做的一些标记，也许会误导大家啊。就是我看的时候，我要想让大家更好的理解这个东西，所以弄了一些就是一些评论式的东西啊。实际上就是大家听了之后，应该能够完全能感受得到这个 Professor Swinburne 他的holy character 的那种机会，就是那种神圣的那种品格的那种机会，就从这个角度来，就是我的就是印象最深的这么一点啊，就是我希望大家就说关于这一点的话，就不要再提太多的问题，就是这个下面提问继续啊，谢谢啊。
I don't know about what you said, so
okay.
I can't comment. So I'll assume it's all very good stuff. Or shall I? Or would you like me to comment?
Maybe after lecture?
Yes. Right. We will assume that he has said important truths to you, and I don't know what they are. Right. Now, yes. No,
I have a question. You mean the God isn't crazy because He gives me more happiness than the sorrowness? And I think maybe you just, I have a thought just because to the public, just to the society, the whole society, maybe the happiness is more than the sorrowness. But to some certain individual, maybe all his life is very sorrow, he is painful. But to him, maybe he can't feel God. Maybe there's no God to an individual, but there's God to the public to agree with this. And I have a question: is if an evil cannot be repeated, is this meaningful? If the evil cannot be repeated by other persons, what we can learn from the evil?
Yeah. All right. Enough.
Okay, I have two questions.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
You put the question in terms of whether the happiness outweighs the badness, as it were, but I didn't put it that way because I think I'm not certain quite what you understand by happiness in China, but in England it tends to mean having happened to you or doing what you want. Now, I suggest that there are more important things than happiness, as it were, for humans. Happiness is a good thing, of course, but the important thing is to desire the right things and to be happy doing the right things. I mean, the torturer might be happy torturing, but that isn't a good state of affairs. It's not a good state of affairs for him, let alone his victim. Because if he finds happiness in torturing, then he's in a really bad way. So don't put it in terms of happiness. It's put it in terms of well-being or something like that. Aristotle used the word eudaimonia, and Aquinas used the word beatitudo, and beatitudo means blessedness. That's the good state. It's not just doing what you want to do. Right. Now, my point is that God puts us in a situation where we have the opportunity to make all of us blessed people in that way, and in a state such that blessedness by far outweighs the bad aspects of pain and suffering that come to us. But I do emphasize again, it's up to us how we use this situation, and God might find, as it were, we all did the wrong thing all the time, in which case it wouldn't, the well-being would not exceed the bad state of affairs, but it is nevertheless good for God to give us these opportunities, because that's the most generous thing he can do to us, to leave it up to us, and that is an enormous aspect of well-being. That is what I've suggested.
Thank you so much.
Right, just behind you first, that's the quickest, and then down here.
Thank you. I have a question about evil. I mean, the evil is not actually it's not the natural evil. The evil is only in human. It's about human. I mean, someone do something bad to something else. I mean, this evil. Bad. I read some paper that his professor writes that maybe the pain or the evil is not important. I mean that he maybe see that the evil is not a thing that sustains.
Could you put
maybe
that?
the good is not sustaining, the very important thing is maybe the reaction attitude.
Could you put that in Chinese, please? And
用中文说，问题简单一点，什么问题直接提就可以了。
shortly, briefly in Chinese, and then perhaps you.
你简单用中文说一下。
那个彼得斯劳森先生曾经写过那个罪与怨恨，然后他里面写的那个他里面写的那个痛苦，或者说这个痛苦其实就相当于这个恶的一个部分嘛。然后他里面就谈到这个就是这个恶的问题，就是在人主体之间的这个恶的问题，人们更关注的是痛后面的这个反应性态度，而不是这个痛本身。所以我觉得这个恶，就是说，如果说从这个方面讲，那个恶可能它就不是一个实体性的东西。它当然本来就不是个实体性的东西，那么它可以 就是因为按照这个奥古斯丁的传统，它本来就是一个是很新的东西，那么可能再也不是新的。我的意思是这个意思。
Is your question about Strawson's article about free will? Is that yes? I see. Yes, it's free will. No. I think the questioner is referring to a famous article by P.F. Strawson, in which he suggested that there are two sorts of attitude we can take to people. We can either regard them as sort of operating as computers under entirely non-rational forces, or we can treat them as having free will and it being up to them and they choose for reasons, and we therefore can treat them either as human beings or as sort of robots. And what Strawson was suggesting was slightly off, it's not very central to what I was saying, but what Strawson was suggesting was that even if people don't really have free will in the sense which I have discussed, nevertheless human society requires us to treat them as if they did, to treat them as acting freely and acting for reasons. All that may be true, but I think it's also true that we do have this free will, though I've argued only for it very briefly in this lecture. It's certainly the way it seems to us when we're making choices, that it's up to us. It's possible that's an illusion, but I don't think it is. And one of the reasons, the only reason I gave in this lecture, is that in fact even the physical world, physicists now recognize, is not deterministic. That's to say, physicists can tell you if a particle of light, a photon, proceeds along a line and it comes to a place where there are two gaps in a screen, the physicists can't tell you which gap it will go through, because the laws of nature don't say that. The laws of nature only say what will probably happen at that level. And the human brain is one of those systems in which very small scale changes make very big scale results. So one would expect the brain not to be a fully deterministic system, and therefore to confirm our intuitions that it's really up to us what differences happen in the brain at the small scale, which get magnified to the large scale, which lead to our human actions. Now that doesn't settle the issue, and it would require at least one other lecture to do so more adequately, but for the purposes of this lecture it'll just have to be do. Yeah, right. Somewhere else, right, chap down here. Oh, where is the mic? Yes. Oh, I promised this lady. She can come first. No, this one first.
The lady first?
All right, I promised the lady first, I think. Then you.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, through the history and now, we human beings can see our material life has really been greatly improved. But do you think our morality has also been improved through all these sufferings we have endured? And shall we get compensated by the morality improvement by the God? And can we see this improvement in morality?
I really hesitate to say. I certainly think that morality has improved in certain respects. I think human societies are much more conscious of the suffering of other societies and often do things to help other societies in a way they wouldn't have done 100 years ago. I mean, when there's a big disaster such as the tsunami in Thailand, vast sums of money were collected from different parts of the world to help relieve the suffering of the people of Thailand. And that sort of sensitivity to the suffering of people in other countries seems to have been very much greater than ever it was. And I think that's a mark of moral improvement. But I think there are other aspects of morality in which things are worse than they used to be. I think people, for example, in the West don't take keeping promises as seriously as they used to. In particular, they don't consider keeping their marriage vows as seriously as they used to. So there's been a decline in some respects. I hesitate to say whether we've advanced or not on balance, but the moral choices are still there for us, and they're still big choices for us. And some of the choices are a little harder to make than they used to be, and some are a little easier to make than they used to be. But we've got a long way to go, I think. Yes, down here. Now, I haven't had any real objections to this line of argument, and I want some.
We believe that all things is created by God. You said that God has the power to cause the evil, but I think the heaven is created by God. So the God is also have the right to cause evil in the heaven. So if people start suffering in the heaven, then
yes,
God happens.
yes, I get the point. Now put that into Chinese.
就是如果上帝世界上所有的事情都是由上帝创造的话，上帝那么天堂也是由上帝创造的。刚才教授说上帝有权利制造罪恶，他是不是也有权利在天堂里制造罪恶？如果在天堂里制造罪恶的话，那这还叫做天堂吗？
Yes, now there I asked for a real objection, and there's a real objection. Let's sharpen it up a bit. The objector says all these religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, say that what we are aiming for ought to be a life of heaven, and in heaven there is meant to be no suffering. So if this is the goal of our lives, and this is perhaps therefore surely a better state than the state in which we have all these choices between good and evil. So isn't there some sort of contradiction in the religions? Right? That's your point? Yeah. Okay. Well, there are some incompatible goods in the world, and that is to say, if you have the one, you can't have the other, and conversely. And one of those incompatible goods is that God could make a world where everyone naturally does the good, or he could make a world in which people have the choice of whether to do the good. It's up to them. But what he can't do is put us in both of these worlds at the same time. And we think that these, when in ordinary human affairs, we think that we come across people who are naturally good. It never occurs to them to do anything bad, and we think that's marvellous. But then we also think it rather marvellous when someone who is not naturally good really forces themselves to be good, forces themselves to start making themselves a good person. But these are both good states, but they can't both happen at once. Now, if God puts us in heaven to start with, he deprives us of the choice of making ourselves the kind of person we are to be, although that state is obviously a very good state. So God has a choice. God has a choice either of putting us in this world where we can exercise certain sorts of good, choosing between good and evil, at the cost of not being naturally good, and therefore not being treated by naturally good people, and therefore suffering a lot. Or he can put us in this world where it's up to us how we choose. Now, I'm not saying the one is better than the other or worse than the other. I'm pointing out that you can't have both at the same time. And what I'm doing is to answer an objection. And I'm answering the objection by saying that the evils of this world do make possible kinds of good which wouldn't exist without these evils. That doesn't rule out the possibility that An equally good state would be where we don't have those particular evils, and therefore we don't have those particular goods. But when you think about it, perhaps the best arrangement is for God to put us temporarily in a world where we have the choice between good and evil, so that we can make ourselves a certain sort of person. And then, if we do make ourselves a certain sort of person, so that we naturally do the good, we are then fitted for a life in a society where we will have the opportunity naturally to do the good forever. So both of these arrangements, both the life of heaven and the life of earth, have their own kinds of goodness, but perhaps the best arrangement is the arrangement which these religions say is the one operative, that is to say, put us in this world for a short period where we have the opportunity to see, to make ourselves the sort of person who would want to go into the other world, or alternatively to make ourselves a different sort of person so that we're not suited for this sort of world. So a sequential arrangement, I think, one after the other, has is the best arrangement rather than confining us to one or other of these worlds.
How many questions are you going?
Well, up to you. I go on.
最后3个问题，好吧？
How many?
Last
Three. All right, three. Yeah.
Thank you. As we all know, everyone is born to be equal, but according to you, someone has to suffer for the happiness in the future. Do you think it's equal enough for the people who have to suffer?
Yes, and I did touch on this in the lecture. That is to say, the important thing here is not to think of the only goods in the world as pleasure and the only bads in the world as pain. That is the wrong. I mean, pleasure is a good thing and pain is a bad thing. But there are other good things which are even better than pleasure, viz. Helping other people to be happy. And there are other bad things than pain, viz. Making other people unhappy. And a world in which we, or you, are simply happy, but of no use to anyone, it's not merely that that's not fair, it's that your life is a bad life, a life that's not good to have lived through your choice. And therefore, when you say, is it fair of God to make me suffer for your benefit, what I've been pointing out is that I'm very lucky to be able to suffer for your benefit. It's a great good for me. Think of me if I was unemployed and couldn't do good to anyone, or lived by myself on an island and couldn't do for anyone. My life would be useless, and that's a terrible life to have led. So better to live a life of suffering that's of some use to somebody. And when you bear that in mind, as it were, there are goods both for the person who suffers and for the person who is benefited by that suffering, and both of them have reason to be grateful.
Hello.
Hello.
Can I speak in Chinese?
Well, if someone will translate for you, yes.
我是一点疑惑，就是我想知道我是灵吗？如果我是灵的话，有多少是天使，有多少是魔鬼？
This question is about M.I. the Holy Spirit. I am the Holy Spirit. Question mark. And others, how about others?
There's a lot in this question, and I'm not quite certain where you're going, to use an English expression. The phrase, the English language phrase, the Holy Spirit, is the name for God, who in the Christian view, as opposed to the Muslim or a Jewish view, God is not just a person, he is somehow or other, and I'm not going to go into how that is the case, a sort of community of three persons, totally working together, totally operative, totally knowing each other, acting as one. And God the Holy Spirit is the name for the third of those persons. A human being is not a God. A human being is not a divine being, and therefore you are not the Holy Spirit. But what you may be confusing the matter with is Christians describe themselves as inspired by the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit living in them. And what that means is that God is inspiring you and directing you, if you will let him, to do good. That is what is being said. Now, next from someone else then. Who did we say?
In your lecture, you showed us that God exists using logical demonstrations and making comparisons. My question is that, in your opinion, is God a fact that can be known by cognition? Can God be known?
Could you just say the last sentence again?
So the truth that God exists is a fact that can be known by cognition. Is that true? Do you agree with the idea? And can God be known?
I think there are good arguments for it. People come to learn about God by different routes. Some people have very deep religious experiences of the presence of God. Other people learn about it because they've been taught and they trust their teachers. But I think in the modern world we don't always trust our teachers, and relatively few people have deep religious experiences. So the best way is that there are good arguments for the existence of God, from the existence of the universe and its conformity to order, and from the universe being so arranged that we evolved from it and that we are conscious beings. That is to say, there are good arguments from the general regularity of the universe to a God who designed it. But what I've been discussing this evening is an argument against the existence of God, and I've been trying to show that it's not a good argument. If I'm right in that, then I do think there are good arguments for the existence of God, but that's not my subject this evening, but I've written a lot about it, and you can find that somewhere or other in books or elsewhere.
Do you prefer one more question?
Yes?
Okay, one more. That's the one.
Thank you for coming today, and it said that the good and harms are both necessary, and we can learn a lot from that, from the sufferings. But what about the death of babies and the death of babies in wars? They don't even have the chance to learn. Does the God don't allow them to learn a lot, learn at all? Thank you.
Yes, now the objections are coming right at the end. First point to make is that I don't think death is in itself an evil. That is to say, death is the end of a good state. If God gives you life for 60 years, well, he's generous. If he gives you life for 3 months, he's generous. You didn't have any right to life at all. So the mere death of an infant in itself is not an evil. But you might reasonably think that, of course, it's a source of great grief to those connected, to the parents and so on. And if the child dies as a result of suffering, then that suffering is, of course, an evil. And yes, this is a very serious matter, but the child, although the child had no option in the matter, by his as it were, his being there he provided the parents with an opportunity for caring and loving him while he lived, and that was a great good for them. So many very ordinary people aren't involved in the government of the world, and they don't seem to have much opportunities for good in life sometimes. But the greatest opportunities for any of us, which comes to almost all of us, is the opportunity to be a parent and to care for someone who is entirely helpless. And the helpless baby gives an opportunity for parents to be unselfish in the way they look after the child, especially if the child is suffering. And that is a great good for them, and therefore a great good for the baby who is in that way of use to them. But of course, I re-emphasize that if you think, well, that's not enough of a good for the baby, I don't think in general you're right, but if you were right in a particular case, then of course it is the normal Christian doctrine, and that God provides an afterlife of compensation, so that on balance the baby's life is a good one.
Because of the time limitation, I don't think we will continue the discussion and the questions. Before we close the lecture, I'd like to give some comments. Firstly, I'm so happy we have so many very good audience, students. You can listen such kind of lecture in English and also ask the questions directly in English. And especially, I admire you have your individual thinking, especially creative thinking, especially your personal ideas about such kind of important program. From this lecture, I think we can understand how is the theorist or theology difficult, and what are very famous religion studies is thinking, especially what is facing the Western religion, what kind of problems they are worried. So I think there are many things we need to think. 在结束之前呢，我想发表一点评论。首先呢，非常感谢我们这么多优秀的听众，大家能够非常直接的用英文来听，而且提问。我觉得大家的提问表现了一个非常重要的，就是一种批判性的思维。大家注意坚持自己的，或者是学术的，或者是信念的，或者是社会的一些这个立场，或者是一些思考。当然，也包含着对于西方文化的理解。按照我的理解，实际上从史文本这样一个非常著名的教授今天的演讲里边啊，大家可以看到，在当代西方文化，尤其是宗教文化中，面临的一种挑战和一个著名的神学家、宗教哲学家他的思考史。大家知道，从长久以来，关于人类的产生，它有一个责任的追溯。这一种追溯就是回到上帝。既然有了一个万能的上帝，那么世界的一切都需要由上帝来负责。达尔文的进化论出现以后呢，找到了一个新的责任者，那就是生命进化中间的不同的阶级、不同的生命体。如果说出现了一些 limitation， 就是出现了一些局限，那就是这个生命体进化的还不够。包括我们人类，人类一直希望寻找到一个最终的根源，就是人类自身的限地到底是怎么产生的，谁应当为它负责。过去我们希望一个很简单的一个上帝能够解答这个问题，现在达尔文进化论提出了挑战。那么，尤其是进入到近代科学以后，大家知道，整个的西方宗教受到了严重的冲击。我接触到一些非常优秀的西方学者，在现代化的面前啊，他们感受到，一方面是清教伦理促进了资本主义的发展， 而资本主义的发展呢，又给宗教的发展确实提出了非常严峻的问题。那么到现代化，尤其是走向全球化以后，人们感受到另外一个问题，就是刚刚不久前逝去的一位著名的学者，叫做亨廷顿，他提出了一个文明的冲突。那么在文明冲突论的背景下，人们发现不同的文化甚至不同的宗教之间仍然在发生着冲突，谁应当为此负责？当然，我不能说，孙木教授就一直在专注地回答这个问题，但是他一直应该说要为这样一个问题寻求解答，那就是世间的罪恶，就是人世间的罪恶是应当为他负责的问题。这个问题很明显是一个涉及到西方宗教的一个根本性的一个，可以说是一个致命性的一个问题。他是希望通过他的这样一个比较严密的论证，来论证这样一些罪恶的存在是必要的，是必然的，甚至有一定的合理性。当然，我们大家我想可能很多在中国的文化背景中，大家不一定会赞成这样一种论证。如果说上帝可以保留制造恶的这样一种权利，就是刚才有一位同学问得很好，他为什么不在天堂里边也去制造恶？如果在天堂里边也制造了恶，那还是上帝吗？这个问题实际上我想是值得我们去思考的。但是我想在这个里边提醒我们同学们注意几个问题。一个问题就是关于神圣世界和世俗世界的关系的问题。实际上我们生活在一个世俗的世界里边，但是人类他是需要有一种理想，所以人类总是在努力地创造一种神圣的世界，这个是上帝的世界或者天堂或者是什么。但是呢，在这两者之间总是需要一个转换。那么在这个转换过程中间可能会产生宗教的解读，也可能会产生非宗教的解读，这是一个问题。第二个问题呢，就是关于善与恶的问题。那么这个里边如果按照一种宗教的标准，一种文化的标准，可能在善与恶之间的区分是相对的。但是实际上大家也知道，即便是在一个国度，在不同的群体之间，善与恶也是一个非常复杂的问题。尤其是进入到不同文化之间的时候，它就变得非常的复杂。你比如说，到底肉蛋是善还是肉蛋是恶，这个问题可能就非常复杂。第三个问题呢，就是那么在我们的这样一种世间存在着恶的情况下，还有没有意志自由？实际上一直在强调的一个问题就是关于自由。这个地方我也想借此机会跟大家介绍牛津大学的另外一位学者，叫做柏林，伊莎亚·柏林，他也是我那一本当代英美著名哲学家的这个学术自述的一位作者。他也是当时第一个响应我的号召，给我们这本书写文章的，而且他给我这一本书写的就是他的最后绝笔，写完以后不久他就去世了。那么写完以后呢，这一篇文章很早的就登出来，登出来里边实际上他在他的文章里边重申了他的学术最大的贡献，就是两种自由，一种叫做 free to， 一种叫做 free from。 我们一般的大家想的自由呢，都是 free to do something，这样呢，你就好像我自由的选择去做某一种事情。他认为还有另外一种自由，叫做 free from 什么呢 ？from limitation。那么每一个人在生活中间都是有限定的，在限定中你去寻求自由，然后你才有可能去真正自由的去行动。我当时在编他这个书的时候我是觉得他对于自由的这两种区分，对于我们今天来理解西方文化和包括生物教授这个讲座可能是有帮助的。那么上帝到底是全知全能，是不是全善？这个问题我想是一个问题，而更重要的在于我们的人世间。我想从孙梦教授的这个地方，我们可以注意到，即便是一个非常著名的神学家，或者是一个宗教学者，他也力图要求现世的人们，在现实的限定中，在罪恶中，在各种麻烦中，在各种杀戮中，去寻求你自身可能的善和你可能有的自由。这一点我想是他可以给我们的很重要的这个启示。当然这个里边可能会需要探讨的问题还会有很多，因为这是一个非常说起来是一个非常简单的，实际上是一个非常深层的涉及到宗教的核心理念和根本存在价值的问题。所以由于时间关系我想我们不可能再继续讨论下去。如果有兴趣的，明天下午3点大家可以到哲学系这个地方去进一步听和他讨论。So I think that we have a very good time we listened to the lecture, and also Professor Richard Swinburne answered our questions very excellently and very warmly, and so let's thanks, especially thanks to Richard Swinburne.
Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much appreciate the compliment that some of you spent 2 hours standing up in order to hear my words, and what greater compliment could there be? Thank you very much.
非常抱歉 I will almost forget. We'd like to thank Professor Swinburne a very small gift, especially our Sioux culture.
一个小公主。